Hello everyone, Brian Kibler here with a sponsored video about MTG Arena. And in this video, I want to help you get good. This video is going to be 5 tips for how you can be a better MTG Arena player. These tips can also be applied to Paper Magic, but basically I assume that you have a basic understanding of Magic and the rules and everything, and just want to improve your chances of winning and, get your better win rate in those matches, climb up in the ranks. So anyway, let's get to it. Number 1, know your role. This is kind of a callback to a seminal piece of Magic writing, Who's the Beatdown? By Mike Flores, which is one of the really important articles that was written when people were really just starting to understand Magic. And the basic gist is that in any given game, and in fact, in any given situation in any game, you need to know what your role is in the game. Are you the aggressor? Are you the control player? If the game continues in a similar fashion over a longer period of time, are you advantaged or are you going to be disadvantaged? And sometimes you kind of just know this structurally. You're playing constructed, you're like, all right, I'm playing a control deck. I have a lot of big, powerful things, a lot of removal. My job is to slow this game down. Sometimes it's less clear. Sometimes you're playing draft or sealed deck. And you kind of have to make the judgment of, am I the aggressor or am I on defense, a little bit more fluidly in terms of, well, my deck seems like it's pretty controlling. I have some powerful cards left in my deck. I don't know if my opponent does necessarily, but because of that, I'm going to try and play in this way. And sometimes in a given game, it can just shift. You can be the player who is the aggressive player, and then something happens and your opponent attacks you for a lot of damage, and suddenly you need to play control. Or you could be playing control and your opponent kills your biggest threat, and you recognize that, okay, now I have to go aggressive because I don't have many powerful cards left. So this can apply in a lot of different ways. One of the things that you want to keep in mind when you are playing, say, as a controller player, is that your goal is to keep the game going for longer. You want to have time to get to your powerful cards to win the game in that longer term. And if you're an aggressive player, you're generally trying to end the game quickly, so you want to press your advantage. You want to keep attacking with things usually. You don't necessarily want to just play around any kind of trick or removal spell your opponent could play, because, well, they need to have more for your future attackers. For instance, an example of how you might play a game differently in spots, you could be playing a game where you have a creature, say it's a utility creature, maybe it can sacrifice to kill one of your opponent's creatures at some point. If you're playing an aggressive deck, you kind of want to get the damage in, you want to attack with that. But if you're playing a control deck, it can be more valuable to you to, say, hold it back from attacking. Maybe your opponent has white mana up, and they could Righteous Blow it. They could kill it if it attacks. And you decide, okay, it's more important that I have this utility creature around for later than the 2 damage I might get in now. So because I'm trying to extend the game, I don't want to give my opponent value from this cheap removal spell for what could be a removal spell from me later. And I just want to hold back, not get that damage in, and play for the long game. So, like I said, sometimes it can be difficult to understand which position you're in a given game, but it's crucial to your improvement as a Magic player to be able to understand and know your role. Next up, we have the second tip, which is study and grow strong. This is another callback to kind of Magic history with the Magic Dojo. This is the slogan of the first ever Magic strategy site. This was, back in the mid-90s, but Magic has grown up a lot since then. That said, it's still very relevant. It's very valuable to have information. This can be true in the basic sense of, what cards are in a set. If you're playing in a draft or sealed deck, knowing the cards that are available to your opponents, what sort of combat tricks they might be able to have, what sort of removal they might be able to have, will allow you to make decisions that are informed and aren't just sort of guessing, oh, well, he could have a trick, I don't know what it could be, I guess I won't attack, go. If, for instance, your opponent has, say, 2 white mana up, and you have the ability to attack them for lethal, you might know, well, none of my creatures died a Righteous Blow, and my opponent can't play, say, Justice Strike because they only have white-white, not white-red, and the only thing they could possibly have to save them is like a hybrid rare card. Well, this is sealed deck, they probably don't have that. I'm going to go ahead and try and kill you. And, lo and behold, that can work. That sort of information is very valuable to you. Similarly, in combat, if knowing that your opponent, say they're playing green, that they can only have either Might of the Masses or the Convoke +3/+3 pump spell, can narrow the range of things that you need to play around. You know that there isn't a titanic growth in the format, so you can block in a way that allows you to beat either Might of the Masses or +3/+3, and that leaves you in a much better spot, being able to understand the important things for you to block against, essentially. And this is very relevant in Constructed as well in a lot of ways. Back when I used to play Magic professionally and traveled to tournaments and everything, and spent a lot of time preparing for events, I would spend significant time every day reading strategy articles about Magic. And not only to potentially learn something from them, but sometimes that happened as well, despite being a very experienced player myself. But even more importantly than that was I wanted to keep up with what other people were reading and what other people were learning. For instance, if I played in a tournament and I ran into a deck that I had read an article about, say the week before, a few days before, I would be better prepared to play against it. I would know, oh, well, this is likely what my opponent's going to be doing. So there's a ton of value in keeping up with both what cards your opponents could have in the sense of sealed deck, just knowing the cards in the format, as well as pay attention to what people are playing. It's all very valuable, it's all very important, and it can do a lot to improve your chances to win. Next up is what I call information warfare. What I mean by this is that Magic is a game which is about information, not just what cards are in the sets, what cards can be in decks, but what a person potentially has available to do at any given time. Usually, you want your opponent to have the least information possible when they're making their decisions, and you want to have the most information possible when you're making your decisions. This is a big part of why, for instance, you don't necessarily want to play out every land that you draw in a given game, because holding lands in your hand can bluff the possibility that you have something to do even when you might not. Similarly, this is the reason that you generally want to attack before you play any creatures or any other cards in your turn. You generally want to make your opponent make their decision about how to block your creatures before you've spent your mana. So you are presenting the most possible threats against them on their, when they're making their decision of how they want to block or how they want to play their removal spells. For instance, if you just tap out and play a creature before combat, your opponent knows the jig is up. They can just do the math on board, figure out, okay, well, I can block here, and I win this fight in this way. And that is often disastrous for you because you just give up all the possibility that your opponent might just not block. Maybe you make an attack, you might not have anything, but because your opponent's afraid that they might not block. They might block in a way that is, they play around something that is more advantageous for you ultimately. It's very important that you just don't give away that information for free. And this isn't to say that you always want to wait till the last minute to do things. Sometimes you want to take advantage of your opponent, say, being tapped out in order to play something. Maybe you have a removal spell, and your opponent's tapped out in your turn. Maybe you'll think, oh, I want to wait and play my removal spell on my opponent's turn, so I have more information. Maybe they play another creature. But sometimes you want to play a removal spell when your opponent's tapped out, because if they have some sort of trick that could stop your removal spell, they could keep you from being able to kill their creature, and that could end up being a disaster. So don't always fall into the trap of, I have to wait until my opponent's turn to play something, because it's an easy general mental rule to follow is, well, I want to wait until I have the most information. But sometimes there are things like your opponent untapping all their mana that make you want to act before you have as much information as possible. So it's a balancing act, and that can be tough to find the right balance. But it is important to keep in mind both principles. You want your opponent to have as little information as possible. You want to have as much information as possible, but you don't want to open yourself up to vulnerabilities like, say, your opponent untapping and being able to stop you from playing what you need to play. Next up, we have Master Mulligans. Mulliganing is a very important part of Magic. In a Magic game, you start with 7 cards, and you can choose to go down to 6 cards and get another look. If your first hand isn't good enough, you can go to 6. You all know that, as I said at the beginning. You all understand Magic. But it's crucial to understand that what you're looking for in a mulligan can be different in different circumstances. Generally, when you're mulliganing, you usually want a hand that has, a good mix of lands and spells. Oftentimes, you want to ensure that you have the colors to play your cards. But the context can be different. You can have a game where that your opponent is playing a slow deck. You may not have all of your colors or necessarily early game defense. And because of that, You're like, okay, well, I have at least colors to play some of my things, and I have time to draw into colors for my to play the other cards that I don't currently have the colors for. So that gives you the opportunity to maybe keep a hand that, in some circumstances, wouldn't look good enough. Similarly, maybe you're playing a deck that needs to be aggressive in a particular matchup. You're playing an aggressive deck. You know your opponent has like a powerful control deck. You may have a mix of lands and spells, but say you have just 2 4-drops. You might have the mana to cast them, but that might not be enough pressure to actually win the game if your opponent has any kind of reasonable draw. So sometimes you'll want to keep hands that don't necessarily have all the colors of mana that you need, or don't necessarily have early game plays. And sometimes you want to mulligan hands that may have what seem to be a good mix of land and spells, but just don't have the right tools for the job. This becomes even more important in constructed play, where if you know what your matchup is, certain cards are maybe even totally useless. Say you're playing a deck that has a lot of removal spells. You have, say, a green-black deck with some Ravenous Chupacabras, and you play against someone who you know to be playing, say, a Jeskai or Esper control deck that doesn't really have many or any creatures. Despite having a hand that may seem good, you will often want to mulligan it because you know that those cards, despite being powerful cards, and you might have a good mix of lands and spells, they're just going to sit in your hand. They're going to be 2/2s for 4, and that's really, really weak. And you definitely want to have a stronger draw for that kind of matchup. So mulliganing is a skill that even top pro players often have disagreeing philosophies on. So it's a very difficult skill to master, and frankly, lots of even the best players will end up asking each other for advice and admit to making mistakes in key situations. So mastering mulligans is very difficult to do, but will absolutely pay off in the long run. Lastly, number 5, we have study sideboarding. Sideboarding is a very difficult skill to master, much like mulliganing, and lots of top pros will even disagree on various sideboard decisions. Sideboarding in Constructed and Sideboarding Limited, that is Sealed Deck and Draft, can be very different sorts of skills, because in a Constructed match, you have a sideboard that you brought with you and specifically constructed for a particular matchup. Oftentimes, in fact you should, know before you even sit down when you play a particular matchup what cards you plan to bring in, what cards you plan to take out. You'll often want to configure your deck differently when you're going first or when your opponent is, simply because the dynamic and the value of certain types of effects can change. For instance, when your opponent is going first, it often increases the value of cheap removal spells because you need to be able to seize the tempo back from them. Whereas when you're going first, you can often get more value out of cards that are powerful proactively, say Planeswalkers, because you can force your opponent to react to them before they have a board. A lot of Planeswalkers are much stronger if you have the initiative. You're the person who has more creatures in play, and your opponent is forced to try and deal with it from the back foot. In Sealed Deck and Draft, sideboarding is a very different beast, because sometimes you can even sideboard into almost a completely different deck, or at least sideboard in a way that significantly changes your strategy. Sometimes, for instance, your opponent will be playing a deck that has a lot of small creatures. You may be playing an aggressive deck of your own, but a lot of your small creatures say they have 1 toughness. So you decide, well, I need to take out my 1 toughness creatures because my opponent has, say, cards that make 1/1 tokens, so I'm going to take those out and put in cards that maybe deal damage to those small opposing creatures. For instance, say you're playing a Boros Mirror match. Maybe you have Blade Instructor in your deck, and your opponent has ways to make 1/1 creatures. And your Blade Instructor is pretty bad, but maybe you have a Cosmotronic Wave in your sideboard. That can give you a way to both push through damage late in the game, as well as potentially clear out those 1/1 creatures, which your Blade Instructor would otherwise just run into and die. So reevaluating the overall strategy of your deck, and not just, well, this is my deck, I'm going to maybe put in a card that seems explicitly good against my opponent. Make sure you're recognizing which of my cards are weak, which of my sideboard cards might be strong, and thinking of the entire pool holistically and trying to get every edge that you can. It's not just, oh, well, maybe my opponent has an artifact or enchantment, I want to bring in a way to kill an artifact or enchantment. You want to figure out how your cards line up against your opponent's cards in the main deck, and figure out how you can make that better when you're sideboarding. And that's true in both limited and constructed. You just have a lot of more flexibility with it, with the broader card pool you typically have in your sideboard in a draft or sealed deck match. Anyway, that's it. Those are my 5 tips to be a better MTG Arena player. There's obviously a lot of depth in all of these different tips, but hopefully these can get you started. If you're looking for more Magic strategy, there's tons of resources out there on the internet. The days of the Magic Dojo may be past, but it has been replaced by sites like StarCityGames.com, ChannelFireball.com, TCGPlayer.com, tons of places where you can find great resources for how to improve your Magic game. So anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the arena.